Happy Saturday morning, everybody, or Saturday evening, Saturday afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another episode of Behind the Fiend Zone video behind the counter. It's getting easier to say that long-ass intro. Today, I have writer-director Steve Mitchell here with us. Steve is known for Chopping Mall. Maybe some of you seen it. If you're a true horror fan, you have. To me, it's one of the greatest 80s horror movies ever made. It played on so many things that was the 80s. Another movie he's known for is a documentary based on the life and the career of the late Larry Cohen. Quite possibly one of the greatest directors and writers to have ever lived. The amount of scripts that's probably still floating out there that man wrote would probably be mind-boggling. But without any further ado, I will bring in the man himself, Mr. Steve Mitchell. Good
Hey,
morning.
John, how are you? What a
Not
flattering intro.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. And I meant every word of it. I love Chopping Mall. I introduced it to my buddy Luke, and he is, when we review movies, he is like, I don't know, he's kind of like Rotten Tomatoes, I guess you would say.
Okay.
But he's so harsh on most, but when he watched that one, he goes, I fucking love this. Pardon my language, but he was like, I fucking love this. He goes, it's got everything I like. It's got death and robots and, all this other stuff in it. So you found a movie that man loved.
Well, I don't know if you have a start-off question, but just for some context, when Jim Wynorski approached me to write it, and I've talked about this a lot, but the one thing I think it's important to just state and restate, well, two things. One, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. We had an idea, but I'm amazed at the things that we did and we didn't worry about before we had to do them. But secondly, Jim and I just wrote a movie we wanted to see. And I think that personal kind of approach to writing a script is very important. I mean, I've had a couple of my other scripts produced. I've written a bunch of others. And one of the things that I kind of figured out fairly early on is that never write anything you don't want to see.
Yeah.
Every one of my scripts, whether I got paid or whether I was doing it on spec, I always wanted to see the movie. And I found that after a certain point, that just became real propellant in the writing process. And I say this all the time. I guess it means something to me. But when we were writing Chopping Mall, I said to Jim, I don't want to have the typical stupid, teenagers who don't do anything. And they're not really teenagers. They're young adults. And they weren't intended to be teenagers. But I want to see these guys defend themselves, because in most horror movies, especially in the 80s, they're so fucking stupid that they don't try and get weapons of any kind to defend themselves. All right, that's point number one. And point number two, because I like guns in movies, I said, how great would it be to have a shootout or gunplay in the middle of the Sherman Oaks Galleria? So that's why our guys are armed to the teeth, even though they figure out pretty soon that, shooting at the robots isn't going to help, but it's going to make them feel better. So there's that. And then there's all the other tropes of the 80s horror genre.
Well, the younger generation now don't realize this, but in the 80s, I was a kid of the 80s. You were making movies in the 80s. It wasn't uncommon to see a gun store inside of a shopping mall. It really wasn't. I mean, I seen like hunting stores and stuff like that all the time.
Well, they were basically sporting goods stores.
Yep.
And they would have firearms in them. They wouldn't have the kind of firearms that we were pushing, and certainly the easy access to them was something that I don't think would have really existed. But I have a saying, it was close enough for government work. and so, again, my agenda was I wanted those guys shooting guns in the Sherman Oaks Galleria because I know it would make me happy to see it in a movie, as opposed to just running willy-nilly like, oh, my God, let's go. Here we're going to go. We can't do, like, stupid teens, for lack of a better term, or stupid young adults in these movies. that gets old very fast. And by the time we did Chopping Mall, we had already had about 5 years of that. So, and I was going to see everything. I mean, I rarely see any new horror movies anymore because they're
Me,
not fun. But in the 80s, I used to see everything. And some of them were fun, some of them weren't. But we were sort of determined, is the word I was grasping for, to make ours as much fun as possible. Because again, it was the kind of movie we wanted to see.
nobody, and I'm going to sound, and my dad's watching because I see it up there. And Daddy, I apologize for saying this, but I sound like my father right now as I'm sitting there like an old man on a porch going, well, that ain't how we used to do it back in my day, but it's the truth. Horror movies are not fun anymore, and nobody has originality to them at all. And the ones that make the most money are normally remakes or reboots of already established properties that took place in the 80s and 90s.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, it's not like I don't see any horror movies. I don't see most of them because they're A, too serious, B, um, they're almost too dark. And I think the darkness is what's important too. I think the filmmakers believe the darkness is what's important to the audience. I guess that's true. I can't speak for many 20-year-olds these days. Those days are behind me, even though I'm a 20-year-old inside.
Me
But
too.
uh, but I'll make my point by saying this: Alligator just came out as a 4K release from Shout Scream Factory, and that's a movie I'd seen in the theater when, in my youth, and I had not seen it for a long, long time. It'd been under the radar, and I just said, "Man, I got to catch up with this again and see if I enjoy it as much as I did." And the answer is absolutely. I mean, by the way, the Blu-ray looks fantastic. I'm going to give Shout a free plug. If you like that movie, buy that Blu-ray. It's astonishing to look at. Okay, but the important thing, and this is what my point was, it was fun. It was, and believe it or not, it most of it is due to Robert Forster willing to make a joke about his receding hairline and his thinning hairline. He said, "Can I do something with that right away?" I just listened to commentary on that. And that positions the movie almost immediately away from just being sort of a dry, dour kind of horror movie where you've got the heroes chasing the monster, et cetera, et cetera. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I like that stuff. But it's amazing how much humor can enhance the horror movie experience. And I think we kind of knew that when we wrote the script. But again, you never know anything until the audience tells you if it's any good. One of the things that I discovered when I did my documentary, King Cohen, and I hopefully we'll talk about Larry because he was a fascinating guy. I loved him. But I felt pretty good when we screened it for the first time up in Montreal at Fantasia Fest. I think that's what it was called. But I had this moment. I didn't do that thing that directors do where I go find a garbage can and puke in it before the show. I didn't do that. I felt pretty confident. But then sort of right before it got started, I said, yeah, but what is the audience going to think? Because, I mean, I had friends and family and all those kinds of people watch it and say, hey, it's not bad. It's not bad. And I was feeling pretty comfortable with how it turned out. But then I realized it doesn't matter what I think. It only matters what the audience thinks. The audience determines whether or not you did a good job. You don't. You do the best job you can, and then it's in their hands. And the audience has been very kind and very generous to us. And pretty early on in that screening, I realized I was in pretty good shape. But not the least of which was because one of the things I discovered about Larry is he's a really funny guy. He was a stand-up comedian at one time. So he's always making jokes. Some of them fall flat and some of them are hysterical. And he has that very dry sort of delivery, so you don't see the joke coming. But very early on in the process, when we were cutting it, I said to my editor, I said, we're going to lean on the humor as much as possible, because that was the thing about Larry I didn't expect. I knew his films. I was a big fan of his movies. I was even somewhat aware of his TV work, but it wasn't until we did the movie that I really discovered the amount of TV work, which just knocked me sideways. And by the way, he has a lot of unproduced scripts sitting in
Yes.
his filing cabinet. One of which I read was a found footage version of an It's Alive movie, which was an interesting script. I think it needed another pass. It was a first draft, but Larry, I always say to my friends, I say, Larry's the master of the first draft. He thinks he nails it in one. And I don't really agree with that. But when he directs the picture, he's sort of doing another draft or two as he's directing the movie. That's why his movies are so spontaneous and oftentimes nuts,
The
because he's just continuing the writing process in the filmmaking.
the beauty of Larry, I've always thought from just reading about him and the interviews I've watched, is he will get this idea and he'll automatically just act on it. Like, okay, I'm going to make a movie about that. Oh, I don't need a budget. I've got and the entire, New York City is my playground here to do something with. And
Yeah.
that was just I don't know, so ahead of its time and just
Well, it makes him an idiosyncratic filmmaker, which is a word I really like because, and I'll give you an example of how that works. I wrote a movie called Against the Law with a guy named Bob Sheridan. And Bob is a guy that I knew from my fan days. And then we decided to try and do something together. And our writing process is a long way to get to the point, but our writing process would be we'd get together, and usually the first half hour to an hour was us talking about stuff we watched or things we were just sharing in general as pals. And he told me he had watched a Larry Cohen movie I'd never heard of. I think it's called Perfect Strangers.
yeah, I've
And
watched it.
it's an interesting movie. And I said, "So how was it?" And Bob had a way of speaking, but you could see him thinking before the words came out. And he would sort of do this a little bit. And he goes, "It's a Larry Cohen movie." And I knew exactly what he meant. That, and I say this in the documentary, that, Larry always took a single card at the end of his movies. It would say a Larry Cohen film. And I really maintain that he's one of the few guys in the history of Hollywood who earned that card. Because, especially when he wrote, produced, and directed, nobody else was telling him how to make that movie. That was a Larry Cohen movie. And look, I think there's some Larry Cohen movies that are not great. I think there's some movies of his that probably would have benefited from another draft, but they are Larry Cohen movies. You feel his fingertips, you feel his hands molding the clay of that movie in a way that makes it a Larry Cohen movie.
Yeah, like
And
Cue the Winged Serpent. When I go back and watch it, and
yeah,
I've showed it to people, and they'll be like, "This just looks like it could have, used a little bit more polish and this, that, and the other." I said, if it was me, I would never touch a damn thing on it because this was Larry's vision. This is what he saw, and you can't mess with it. Just leave it alone. Let it be.
I agree with that. By the way, I think there are one or two, like, for example, I'll just go on a limb, and I'm sure your listeners are probably want to throw tomatoes at me, but I think the stuff is a little bit of a mess.
Yeah,
I think
it
the
is.
stuff starts out as one movie about, that kid, then it becomes the Michael Moriarty movie, then it kind of becomes the reactionary right-wing mercenary army movie. And so it's a little all over the place. But I suspect that the little all over the place aspect of the movie is kind of what makes it so appealing. Because when I was making King Cohen, I shot a bunch of stuff at a convention in Indiana, and I interviewed fans, and they all loved the stuff. Now, the stuff is a phenomenal idea. Larry's high concept ideas were always fantastic, and I just don't think he completely executed it in the script. But you watch the stuff, and when all is said and done, and that end title card comes up and it says Larry Cohen film, you go, yeah, it's a Larry Cohen movie. There's nobody like Larry, and in many ways. And I'll say one other thing. I'm sure you have other questions. Um, I think that for a guy who's as funny as he was and his movies had a lot of humor, when he actually did comedies, they were terrible. I mean, The Wicked Stepmother, I know he lost Betty Davis after the first week, and I saw, and the way he sort of, he kind of saved his own bacon and figuring out how to do it was very impressive, but it's not very funny. Um, Barbara Carrera, by the way, is astonishing in it, and it's almost like she's in her own movie. But Larry managed to figure out a way to get it done. But I don't think it's very funny. And the other movie, we did a commentary together on Full Moon High.
I love that movie.
Well, I just think it's a mess. I'll go on the record. Larry, I love you. I truly do. It's a mess. We're driving home from the commentary. He says, "What did you think?" I said, "It was horrible for him to put me on the spot like that." And I said, "Well, had a great cast." And then he told me a story. Then he told me a story where after the movie was over, the lights came up and everybody left and nobody said anything. He was, and I think he was somewhat hurt by that because I think Larry was an emotional guy and he wanted to make his version of an American where I was a teenage werewolf. But he's very ham-fisted when it comes to doing comedy. When comedy is leaking out of a character or finding its way into it, organically, his stuff is very funny. I mean, Q, that whole scene where Michael Moriarty is talking about he wants the Nixon deal, and he's just he's a guy with no power who gets a certain amount of power, and of course, what does he do? He goes over the top with it. It's A, socially interesting, and it's also B, funny and entertaining to watch at the same time.
A lot of Larry's movies to me always seemed like there was a bit of almost like a love letter quality to them, like the stuff. The stuff seemed to be like John Carpenter's The Thing, an Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and a little bit of Alien all mashed together. Q seemed to be like the Giant Claw from the 50s, that terrible B movie from the 50s where all you saw was this just crappy looking claw and this vulture head on a string. But
I
I don't
love
know.
that picture. It's so awful. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
But I got to tell you a quick thing about that. And I think it's in the documentary, but I shot so much footage with Larry, I don't always remember. So I run the risk of being repetitive. But for those of your listeners who haven't seen it, Larry's talking about 50s monster movies, and he loved Q. He wanted to do a movie where the Chrysler Building was the architectural star of the picture, the way the Empire State Building was in King Kong. But we're talking about 50 science fiction movies and all these female scientists. It says, I never believed any of these things because you always had the actress with the big boobs. And I never believed any actress with boobs that big could be a scientist. And Mara Corday is in that thing. And I believe Mara Corday was a Playboy playmate in the 50s, and she played a scientist in a couple of movies. Tarantula, I think, was another one. But the thing is that there were always attractive women with, as he put it, big boobs at playing scientists. And Larry did not want to have that in his movie. The other thing that he didn't want to have, which was sort of brilliant, is that when you go back and you watch a lot of those 50s movies, they feel the need to explain everything to the audience. And Larry said, I don't want to explain anything. It's, the serpent is here. It's killing people. It's running around. There was that strange subplot with the Mayan sacrifice or the Aztec sacrifice thing, which I never completely understood. Again, early Larry Cohen first draft, probably. But it's a movie that kind of proves you don't need to have all the facts to still enjoy the insanity of watching a giant, serpent flying around Manhattan,
Biting people's
killing
heads off.
people. Yeah, exactly.
The effect of it just swooping down, biting people's heads off was always what got me.
It's fantastic.
And I also watched that he said that he actually filmed all the scenes in a helicopter and then he would just put Q into it. So he's like the background moving and Q never really synchronized. So it was
Yeah,
always.
and I think we talked about that where, he was told by all these effects guys, it's not how it's done. Well, you don't tell Larry Cohen what to do ever.
Yeah.
And so he got that first day of helicopter shots. I think he shot that the first day, and then they just sandwiched the serpent in on those shots. Did you ever notice, by the way, there's a certain unfinished or unpolished aspect to all of Larry's movies.
Yeah, it's got that grindhouse look to it,
A
very much.
little bit, but it just, like the effect might not be complete, or something just, the gears don't quite sync up, and that also makes it a Larry Cohen movie. Although I will say, Q's my favorite, but The Ambulance is a very close second. And The Ambulance is actually, of all his movies, probably the most complete in terms of the filmmaking, that he actually had money and that the movie has a little polish, but it's still such a great idea. And it was especially a good idea because, my first career is I worked in comics. So having a protagonist who works in the comic book business was fantastic to me. But you watch that movie, it has more polish to it. It doesn't quite feel as raw, but the idea is so audacious and so nuts that it's completely a Larry Cohen movie.
Well, getting to you and your career, and you just kind of gave me a nugget right there. What got you started? I mean, was it comic books and then comic books morphed into movies, or was it always movies?
I'll tell you what it was. I grew up in New York City, and I was a comic book fan and a movie fan as a kid. My dad was a greatest generation guy who loved movies. And so I grew up watching tons of stuff on local television, sometimes with his steerage. He would say, "Oh, this is on, you should watch this." And it wasn't just horror or monster stuff, which I watched everything when I was a kid. But, like my dad turned me on to The Thing, the Howard Hawks thing from the 50s, which was and still is my favorite movie. Um, but, he would talk about movies like Them, anything that had the military in it, that had a kind of a greatest generation uh, slant to it. My dad really liked it. He would recommend, but he also recommended film noirs. He was a big Warner Brothers fan, so he steered me towards Errol Flynn and Cagney and Bogart. So the movie fan thing was in my DNA, but I also love comics. And because I grew up in New York City, I could go visit the offices and see my heroes sometimes, because the guys who wrote and directed the books did not work at the offices. They
Yeah,
were
they worked at
freelance
home.
and they worked at home, but they had places where artists could come in and maybe finish up something, or if they, God forbid, they were asked to make some corrections. There was a bullpen, a production department where that had some extra drawing boards where they could sit and do some work. And then there were certain guys. I mean, I don't know how big a comics fan you are, but
Oh, if you could see my closet, it's not clothes, it's all comics.
okay. So when I say Neil Adams and Murphy Anderson, you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, Neil Adams is basically on my Mount Rushmore of artists. I went to art school for comic book art and stuff, and Neil Adams is he's basically like God to me in terms of comic book art.
Well, Neil was somebody who got free office space at DC because that meant they could access him and try and get him to do a quick cover. And if you recall, in the 60s into the early 70s, he was doing a ton of covers for DC Comics. And I was a fan in those days. And so when I would see those comics and I'd see those covers, what would happen is it would usually make me drop my paper route money, because I had a paper route to pay for my comic book habit. And Neil was the bait. Neil was such a different look for comics at the time. It just completely, I was just completely overtaken by it. And so, but I got to know Neil a little bit as a fan, and then he shared a room at DC with Murphy Anderson. These guys just like to go to work, and so they got free Midtown Manhattan studio space, which of course benefited DC, because if they needed something inked by Murphy, who could handle anything that had to do with Superman. And then they had Neil, who could pretty much handle anything. That it was to DC's benefit to let them have those offices. And so I used to hang around and be a pest. I wanted to work in comics because Hollywood was far, far away. I didn't think I would have any access to it. And one Easter, I think I was in high school. I think I was a junior in high school. I went to the High School of Art and Design, which is a famous school in New York. A lot of comics guys came out. Marv Wolfman went there. Larry Hama went there. Dennis Cowan went there. Um, and I was just literally hanging around on my Easter vacation. And Saul Harrison, who was this guy, I was literally a foot taller than the guy. And he scared the shit out of me. He was just one of these intimidating guys. But I was, again, a foot taller than he was. He said to me, he says, if you're going to hang around, you should get paid. So this was on a Wednesday of my Easter vacation. The next day I went in. He said, come in the next day. And I worked a couple of days and they liked me. And he said, come back over the summer. So that's how I sort of got into comics, through that summer job. And I worked in the production department. I was doing all kinds of, grunt work, monkey work. I think at one point I may have even gone out and bought Carmine Infantino's cigars because he always had a cigar. He smoked a kind of Clint Eastwood cheroot in those days. So I had done that. And then I sort of was kind of in the overall kingdom of comics. And I sort of, found my way into the business. But I had access. So many guys literally chose to move to New York from all over the country. I didn't have to move anywhere. I was already there.
Yeah, I had the honor to actually meet Neil Adams. God, it's been 3 years ago. I went to the Comic-Con here, and I've always had this thing where I've watched how people interact with these, comic writers, artists, and there's always, talking about comics. And I'm like, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm going to go up to them and talk about how they're enjoying where they're at and how the family is and, just regular stuff. Treat them like a regular person. And I did that with Neil. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting there 30 minutes with this guy that to me is
Wow.
like a living legend. And, he told me something because I was still in art school at the time, and I just asked him for one piece of advice, and he gave me this, and I don't know how much of this is, the norm for most people. He's like, if you can't draw it, trace the hell out of it. And I'm sitting there thinking like, but art school teaches us not to do that. He goes, I don't give a fuck what art school tells you to do. He says, any artist that tells you he doesn't trace is a damn liar.
Well,
So that's the one thing
it's
I took away.
it's deeper than that. And I worked for Neil when he and Dick Giordano had a studio called Continuity Associates, which he still has. Alan Kupperberg and I were the first two assistants. And Neil had a thing on his drawing table. It was this giant overhead projector called an artograph. And he learned when he was doing newspaper work and advertising work that you get reference, you put it in there, and then you can sort of arrange it on a page. And then you can either use that as your underdrawing for pencil, or I'm sure at some point maybe Neil just would start inking away, using that reference. So reference is a thing that real grown-up artists use. Cartoonists might not at the time, but real grown-up illustrators and newspaper strip guys use it all the time. So that what he suggested was, I think, maybe an offshoot of that.
Well, like you were talking about with him and how he changed art, I don't mean to be off topic, but when I look at comic book artists from today and even in the past, I still, look at Jack Kirby, and I like Kirby, but when I look at those that changed the game, I look at Steranko and Adams. Those are the two to me that kind of changed the way things are drawn in comics. Steranko more of the psychedelic effect, but
Well, Jim was a great storyteller. I think people don't talk about that enough. He was all about storytelling. And then Neil just brought that sort of newspaper strip illustrative vibe to comics, which was mostly about cartooning. And Neil brought that slight illustration vibe to comics. And let me tell you something, and I know this for a fact, everybody wanted to be Neil back in those days. Irv Novick, Bob Brown, um, a lot of young guys. Dick Giordano became a better artist because of his time with and around Neil. Everybody looked at what Neil was doing, and they tried to bring that to the dance. And then, of course, Neil started doing Batman, and he did Dead Man, of course, which I guess people do or don't remember. I'm not
I,
entirely sure.
I've got a whole collection of Dead
Yeah,
Man.
they're amazing. And so Neil kind of opened the door to a new way of thinking about comics. Now, I'll say this. I think Neil is a terrible storyteller. Neil, and you say, well, what do you mean by that? And I'll tell you. I was told by Joe Kubert what storytelling is. And it was very simple. He said, you're able to read the story and understand it without reading any dialogue. And, I always said good storytelling is like filmmaking. I mean, we're getting back to the filmmaking connection. The thing is that a panel of comics was the perfect frame of film for that part of the story you needed to tell. The other thing that Neil never could do is use space. Almost all of his stuff looks like it's crammed inside that panel. Now, I think comics, when I look at art from my time, they're shamelessly overwritten. They're shamelessly overwritten, so much so that I'm almost appalled by it. Especially today, most comics seem to be underwritten, but a lot of good comics today, the writer is working with the artist in a sense. Whereas in the old days, the writers were just trying to hold up their end and they didn't care about the end result. They just wanted to make sure everybody got the story. And so Neil was fighting a lot of dialogue, but he was just terrible with space. Look at what Joe Kubert used to do. I mean, I know because Joe Kubert did war comics, people don't know that as well. But if you look at his Sergeant Rocks,
Mm-hmm.
his understanding of storytelling and use of space, and he was the complete package. And I think, strangely enough, Neil, for all his brilliance, and he was brilliant, was not great at that. And then, of course, contradictorily, if that's even a word, his covers were fantastic. Because Neil, I think, had an inner illustrator in him. So when he was dealing with one picture, he was able to do it better and more excitingly than a lot of people. And by the way, I think some of Neil's greatest covers had nothing to do with superheroes. His Tomahawk covers were spectacular. They were dramatic. They were great illustrations, great compositions. Even the Tomahawk covers in certain instances use space very well. His House of Mystery covers, House of Secrets covers for Joe Orlando were fantastic. And his sort of like what I call almost like art house covers, art house in the movie sense, were the Phantom Stranger covers, where the Phantom Stranger was not the dominant part of the visual all the time. So Neil, as an illustrator, and I'm sure you've seen his Tarzan paperback covers that he did. They were fantastic. So it's an interesting contradiction, but Neil was a very exciting storyteller. The energy he put onto a page really, I think, caught the imagination of the readership at the time.
I'll send you a picture when we're done today. I've got a Doc Savage that he drew hanging in my living room,
Oh, no kidding.
and it's beautiful. I mean, it's got Doc Savage's oath off to the side, and then he's drawn it like old school pulp magazine style, and it's
Right.
with some
That sounds
watercolor.
like fun. Neil would be very well suited to doing Doc Savage comic books.
Yep, because
Anyway, so I had this career in comics, just getting back to your original question. And I used to go out to California for Comic-Con. And I had a friend of mine, Jim Wynorski, of all people, who had moved. And so I would go to Comic-Con, and then I would go up to LA for a couple of days afterwards and stay with Jim. And I came to like Los Angeles, and because express mail and FedEx had been invented, you did not have to live in the New York tri-state area to work in comics. It used to be everybody lived in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, because you had to get the work in sometimes the next day. Well, once technology was developed, so you could send a package from Los Angeles to New York and have it show up the next morning, everybody was free to live wherever they wanted as long as they had a FedEx box or a post office box, a post office rather, near them. And so I was kind of tired of New York. My wife and I, we had a pretty decent apartment. I liked living in New York, but I think by the time I was ready to move, I was tired of New York. And I think secretly inside me, I wanted to maybe see if there was any way I could get into the film business. So comics were my backup because I could still work and make a living, but it would give me the opportunity. Like I didn't have to worry about paying the bills, and then I could maybe play around in that new sandbox. And so we packed up our truck one weekend and drove cross country and somehow survived. Once again, it's the sins of youth where you think, oh, we'll just pack up the truck and drive it out. Like 7,000 things could have gone wrong. But you don't think about it. You just think, well, this is what I got to do, and you do it.
So you get out to California, were you just content to be in comics, or did somebody just come along that kind of sparked your interest in film?
I was content as long as I enjoyed the pencilers that I was working with, because I was an inker. That was my discipline. But my first flirtation with the movie business was Steve Gerber and Mary Screenis and I were having lunch at Comic-Con. And Mary, I think, said, because I had written a couple of feature scripts, spec scripts in New York, one with her. And she said, well, why don't you ask Mitchell if he wants to write for G.I. Joe? Because Steve Gerber was the story editor on G.I. Joe. Now, I've never been a cartoon guy. I'm not an animation guy, although strangely enough, I've had sort of a minor career in animation. And he said, yeah, you want to write for G.I. Joe? And I said, well, I didn't really know shit about G.I. Joe. And he said, well, you like movies, don't you? And I said, of course, that's kind of my religion. I mean, comics was my career, but movies were my religion. And he said, well, I don't want cartoon scripts. I want movie scripts that are going to be animated. And somehow that clicked for me. I wasn't writing, badly animated TV shows. I was writing a movie in my head. And so I wrote, along with my wife, I think 4 G.I. Joes. And we wrote a Transformers. We wrote some other stuff. And the money was good, and there were no restrictions. I mean, the thing that was great about G.I. Joe is you couldn't kill anybody, but everything else, you could shoot stuff, you could blow stuff up, hand-to-hand combat, all of that stuff. You had almost no restrictions. You just couldn't kill anybody. It was like doing the A-Team before the A-Team.
Well, it was basically the 80s. Those cartoons, as much as I loved them, they were just 30-minute toy commercials. So that pretty sure that's why you couldn't kill anybody off, because they were trying to sell that particular toy.
No, well, it's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but I just think that they didn't want to kill anybody. The chaos and the action was enough. But if you wrote for the networks, it's amazing what you couldn't do for the networks. I mean, I think one G.I. Joe I wrote, it was the last one. It was not fun to do. You couldn't even have somebody pointing a weapon at someone, like to hold them a prisoner, because that was considered a violent act. And I said, how do you do a war show without some form of violence or implied violence? So it stopped being fun, and then the show was finished anyway. So I continued on, and then I'm sure you know how I got Chopping Mall, don't you? Or should I
Well,
talk about it?
you can talk about it, because I'm pretty sure a lot of the listeners don't know.
Okay. So Jim Wynorski was a friend of mine from New York. We knew each other in fan circles. I collected movie stills and posters, and he did. And we used to go to conventions, and we'd hang out a little bit. And Jim called me up and said, Julie Corman has a situation, and we could benefit from this. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, Vestron Video wants to finance a movie about a killer in a shopping mall. And she said if we could come up with an idea that they approved, they'd give us a deal. So I said, great. So we met at a local diner type place near us. We didn't live too far from one another. And we sort of beat out an idea for a Phantom of the Mall kind of story. Stupid teenagers running around being chased by a guy with a knife. Not terribly original, but that's what Vestron was looking for. So we beat that out. That's a writer term if you've never heard about it. There's no violence involved. And we beat out the story, and then Jim turns to me and he says, what if we do it with killer robots? And I'm glad you can see my face, because I'm going to give you my reaction, which was, okay. And because I was confused by it. But so we threw out the Phantom of the Mall thing, and then slapped together something halfway between a synopsis and a beat sheet for this killer robot movie. Julie takes it, sends it to Vestron Video, and in 1 week we had a go picture. No script.
Damn.
We had a go picture based on an idea.
That don't happen very much.
No, that don't happen at all. So Jim and I wrote it at Roger's office in about 4 weeks. We got them our first draft. They had notes. Most of them were stupid, as I recall. We did, I think, 2 more passes on the script in like a week or 10 days. And then we wound up, going into production. Now, there was a restaurant around the corner from Roger's office that we used to eat at a lot, a place called Hamburger Hamlet, which was kind of an LA chain of, it wasn't a hamburger place. They featured great hamburgers, more like steakhouse quality, but you can get anything. Anyway, I've just done a great advertisement for a restaurant that doesn't exist, but in the spirit of context. So anyway, we go over there for lunch, and Robert Short is coming out. And Jim knew Bob, and he said, hey, Bob, if you got a few minutes, we may have a job for you. Now, I didn't know Bob, and Bob was involved with practical effects. So Bob, being the smart businessman that he was, said, sure, I got a few minutes. So we tell him about this nutty story that we wrote, which at the time was called Killbots. And he said, yeah, I think I can do it. Now, here's the crazy thing. No one has ever done anything like this, practical robots and stuff like that, radio control, etc. But he wants the job. So I had done an early design for the robot, because I always thought of the robots as if Darth Vader had had sex with a Sherman tank, what would they look like? And so I had a design which was at best okay. And then Bob took that and worked up a bunch of designs, and he came up with the ultimate design, which I still think is fantastic. It's just a great looking robot. And so we made a deal with him, and then he started to go to work while Jim and I cast the movie. You'll notice on Chopping Mall there's no casting credit, because Jim and I did the casting. And let me tell you something, every great looking woman in Hollywood, in her early 20s, literally walked into that office. At one point, Ben Stiller came in and auditioned for me for one of the parts. And God, the darkness that he had, He just seemed a little too dark for my taste. But I auditioned Ben Stiller, and it worked out for him, I think, career wise. And so Jim and I had cast, we figured out who we liked. Um, Russell Todd was somebody that Jim had seen in Where the Boys Are '84. I hadn't seen it. I thought Russell did, Russell came in, who was fine. But there was another actor named John Terlesky who came in to read for that part, and I liked him better. But I'm only the writer and sort of his partner on this. And he wanted Kelly Maroney to play the lead. He had seen her in Night of the Comet. I had not. But this, oh man, what the hell was her name? This actress came in who had played Chuck Norris's daughter in Lone Wolf McQuade, and I thought that she was really charming, and I liked her, and she read for Julie, and Julie liked her, and it was one of those things where Julie and I both preferred her over Kelly. The problem is, this gal would not kiss the actor who played Ferdy for, I believe it was religious beliefs. So it kind of disqualified her from the part. And then Jim said, let's get Kelly, let's get Kelly. And we all said, sure, fine. Okay, so Russell is in it. I wanted John Terlesky, but no, Russell's in it. Kelly has been cast. And then I said to Julie, I said, well, this guy, John Terlesky, is so good. Why don't we give him this part? We gave him one of the other guys, Mike. And we all said, yeah, because he made a good impression with all of us, talent-wise. There's a famous story. I don't know if I've talked about it on the Blu-ray, the Vestron Blu-ray, but it bears repeating. Somehow he got my phone number, and on a Saturday morning about 8:30. Now, in those days, I used to go to sleep at 4 a.m. So getting a phone call at 8:30 in the morning, I was really asleep. I was not ready for this phone call. And it went more or less like this. Hi, Steve. It's John Terlesky calling. Oh, John. Yeah. Hi. What's up? He says, well, I have a problem. I said, what's the problem, John? He says, well, you remember I auditioned for Chopping Mall? And I said, yeah, of course. And he says, well, but you're offering me the part that I didn't audition for. And I said, yeah, well, we decided to go with Russell, but I liked you so much, I wanted you to still have a part in the picture. And so he didn't sound happy about this, although he was getting a job. It was going to only for, I think, a week, but he's still getting a job. And then we had a read through one afternoon, and he didn't seem to be into it. And I said to Jim, I said, wow, maybe we made a mistake. And then we get to the famous Sherman Oaks Galleria to make the movie, and John turns out to be fantastic. He's all the stuff with the gum, with chewing. He was chewing, I think, 3 or 4 sticks of gum at once all the time. And so that was his, and what a great little piece of signature work. And he turned out to be the greatest guy. And we were, we had a lot of the same taste in movies and stuff like that. And he's still one of my best friends today. In fact, I had lunch with him yesterday, and he gave up acting to direct, and he's been directing television for quite a while now. I think he's directed over 100 hours of television. But
I was going to say, I see that you had Barbara Crampton in this movie too, from Reanimator. How'd you end up coming across her?
Barbara came in and just knocked it out of the park. And I once asked Barbara something about auditioning. She says, I love auditioning. She just said, I just let it go. And so she let it go, and we cast her immediately. We didn't know much about her. At least I didn't know much about her. But all I know is she came in and she had great energy, and she just seemed to really be perfect for the part. And again, this is where I think the movie god kicked in with us. I think she and Kelly had great chemistry together. So you believed that they were friends. And as far as I know, I think they're still pretty good friends today, all these years later.
I mean, when you go back and you look at Barbara Crampton, I mean, one, she was just beautiful. And two, I have yet to see any movie that she's ever done where she didn't give everything she had to the part. I mean,
have you seen Jacob's Wife?
Not yet.
Oscar caliber performance. She's fantastic in it. Um, it was one of those things where I was aware of it, and I said, "Let me see if I can see that," because I was curious. Because she was, I think, involved in producing it as well, and she is sensational. I said to her, I said, "Barbara, it's not just a good performance; it's a great performance by you. It's really high level work, and I think it was work that goes beyond just any horror movie. So I can't recommend it enough."
Yeah, I heard through circles of, my friends that watch movies like me that it was almost like she revitalized her career with that one movie. I just haven't had the chance to watch it yet.
She has worked apparently very hard at making a comeback. Now, she, I think, got married and I think she retired, sort of,
Hmm.
and had a couple of kids. And then once the kids, I guess, had grown, she wanted to get back into it. And Barbara is a very dedicated um, actress, producer, but she also knows how to work the room. I mean, I saw her down at what's the festival in Texas? Fantastic Fest. Yeah, I think it was Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas, where we ran King Cohen. And man, she was like the belle of the ball. Barbara is like horror fantasy film royalty, and she works hard at that. And she was also in London at Fright Fest, where we also screened King Cohen. And again, working the room. I think she had one movie she had a small part in at that festival. But Barbara is tremendously dedicated to having a career, and she's not a kid. Um, and I just love the fact that she's really nailing it and finding a way to keep acting. And she's not a kid, but she looks sensational. And talent wise, Barbara's always been very talented. She's smart, she's clever, she's inventive. We were lucky to get her on Chopping Mall. In fact, we were lucky to have everybody on Chopping Mall. We were
Yeah, and a lot
so
of people
lucky with that cast. They had great chemistry.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize about Barbara Crampton. She came over from the soap opera side of the house, and when she was with Stuart Gordon, I remember watching a thing where Stuart Gordon was talking about how she was a trooper. He was like, "Dude, I put her in so many uncomfortable positions and reanimate her, and she never complained, not once."
I think Barbara is just a force of nature. She's kind of bold, and she said her has no fear, and I think that has served her pretty well. You know, um, Tony O'Dell was great. Carrie Emerson, who I will admit I've always had a bit of a crush on, because she kind of reminds me of Margaret Sheridan in The Thing. We kind of wrote her a little bit like Margaret Sheridan. And Carrie was great. We saw Carrie at a reunion screening, and I said, "Carrie, why did you walk away?" And she said, "I didn't like to audition," because I thought, well, Carrie's astonishing to look at. She's pretty on camera and she's pretty in real life, unbelievably pretty. But I thought that she had some talent. I mean, there's a line, and this is one of those things when you write something, you think you're real fucking clever. And I think I wrote this line, and of course I should have been embarrassed by it, which is, "I'm sorry, Freddie. I guess I'm just not used to being chased around a mall in the middle of the night by killer robots." In and of itself, that's not a great piece of dialogue if you know anything about writing. But Carrie, when she says it, she finds the emotionality in it. She sort of slides down this glass case. She's in one of the department stores in the mall, and she just nailed it. She just absolutely nailed it. And everybody in the theater, because we had this 29th anniversary screening, and it was like a high school reunion for most of us, because a lot of us were there. But it was an audience full of fans, and they just let out huge, roar of approval and applause and everything like that. And I'm going, wow, I'm feeling pretty good about something I did 29 years earlier. And I think what was kind of great for us And this is one of the things that I think not a lot of creative people get, especially writers. If you sit and you're writing on your own, you're writing in your office, your jail cell, your cave, your whatever, and you don't, you're in a bubble. It was that night where I realized how much the movie works for the audience, and it was enormously gratifying. And I think it was so great when the cast came out, and Chuck Serino, our composer, did a wonderful score. Bob Sheridan, Jim, myself, the cast, we all sort of got to take a bow. We got to sort of, do this and, do that and say thank you. Yeah, it was only 3 decades in the making, but it was a great night. It was great that everybody associated with the movie that night understood how much the movie was loved. I mean, the guy who was hosting it after the movie was over, Ryan Turek. He came out and he yelled, "Oh God, I fucking love Chopping Mall!" And everybody in the theater is going. And I have to say that again, when we wrote it, when we made it, we just wanted to make something we would see. We had no idea that it would land for the audience and keep landing for the audience all these years later.
Yeah, because I'm sure when you all made it, you were just like, we'll get it out there, make Vestron happy. But I don't think you all. Is it safe to say you didn't foresee this legacy that this movie would have?
Oh, it is completely safe to say I had no idea. Now, but I just have to correct you a little bit. We were very enthusiastic every single night when we went to work. Now, I directed 9 days of second unit on the picture. I did some scenes with the actors, but I did most of the robot stuff and the other non-first unit type stuff. And our energy was very high. Our enthusiasm was very high. The only thing people were unhappy about was the catering for the first week was dog shit. And Jim, to his credit, complained to Julie saying, we're in the middle of the night, we're in the mall, and then this food shows up that nobody likes. You got to get us real catering. So we got real catering for the next 3 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks. And that made everybody happy. Lesson to be learned: if you make any kind of a movie, low budget, high budget, any budget, the food should be good. That matters. It matters to the crew and to the cast.
One of my dear friends, Steve Merlo, he just got done making a Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan film.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about that, how he went down to Texas to shoot it and everything, and how now he hates barbecue, or he got tired of barbecue and tired of pizza. And I could totally
agree. How that's possible, but okay.
Well, I guess down there, if you eat it every day, it gets. But yeah, I mean, if you don't have good catering, then that just affects the morale overall, I'm sure, and you get less than enthusiastic performances on the camera.
Yeah. Everybody really gelled on this movie. I don't think that there was any animosity or boredom or just want to get through the night on this piece of shit and go home and get some sleep. I never got any sense of that. And I was on set every day, even the days where I wasn't shooting. I was just on set every day. So, because it was a big deal for me. I wanted to see what worked and what didn't work.
Now we fast forward, you get to the opening and you go and all that. Was the response there when y'all got there? Was it like, oh my God, we nailed it, or did it take a while for it to kind of build its cult following?
Here's what happened. As far as I know, we had a test screening in North Hollywood one night when it was still called Killbots. And the audience did not like it. The audience did not respond to it. We were there with Roger and Julie Corman. And Roger and Julie Corman, of course, always panic because, God forbid, the movie loses 10 cents. Now, the secret, and it's not a secret, Vestron paid for the whole picture. Vestron, it was their money. It wasn't the Cormans. Now, Roger had a deal where he had TV rights and theatrical rights. In fact, I think this is one of his last theatrical releases from when he was Concord New Horizons. He had already sold New World, but he had theatrical. And, Roger wasn't stupid. He said, well, I want to make money. And then this tanked as Killbots that night. So they changed the title to Chopping Mall and changed the key art as well. And then the movie got released. It got mostly 2-star reviews. And so we said, well, we made a movie that we had a great time making it. We had a great time writing it and making it. And we enjoyed it because it was a movie that we wanted to see. But as I said to you earlier, the audience, or the critics too, determine your fate. Cut to, I think it had to be decades later, where Jim is talking to me one day, and he says, when was the last time you looked at the IMDb page for Chopping Mall? I said, I couldn't tell you. He says, go look at the comments. Pages and pages and pages of comments of people saying how much they love the movie, even though virtually every comment included the word cheesy. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I think the American Dairy Association owes me a little money, for all the cheese that I've spread. But I have to say, I was surprised and a little shocked at the overwhelming positive response the movie had. I just couldn't quite believe it, because it was already in my rear view mirror at this point. I had no idea if it made an impact. And I since found out that Vestron, I think, shipped 500,000 VHS units on that title. Now, unfortunately, we had a buyout, because if we had any kind of participation in that, we would have made a lot of money. Maybe not a lot, but we would have made money. All we got was, our fees up front. And so Vestron probably made about $20 million on that title. Because they had worldwide home video, so maybe they made more than that. I don't know. But it was a huge success in the home video world, which is fascinating to me, because the home video world changed movies as I knew them, and deals and revenue streams. And now home video means virtually nothing to a success of the movie. If you have a successful movie, maybe it might mean an extra $10 million on top of the theatrical. But back in those days, guys like Roger and New World Pictures and Avco Embassy and Orion and TriStar and Atlantic and Trimark, any mark you can think of, they could make money making movies. Cinetel, who I wrote a movie for, they could make money off home video, because home video was potent, as was foreign. And now none of that exists. And I got to tell you, quite honestly, I don't know how anybody makes any money in the movie business anymore, unless you're hired by Netflix or Amazon to make something and you have really nice fees. But it's really different. It's a little distressing to me, to tell you the truth.
Going into that video store, before the internet, that's how you got, it was, to me, I remember Chopping Mall always had that beautiful box art, the robot arm holding the shopping bag, and there's body parts in it. That's all you needed. It's that, just that box sold that movie. It made you want to pick it up and watch it. And you don't have that anymore. So I totally agree, because back then the box art was, you put a lot of work into that. Now, some did get lazy with it. I will admit, some did. Warner Brothers especially used to be kind of lazy with their box art, but a lot of the independent horrors and stuff like that put a lot of money into that, because that's how they pushed it.
I actually think, and I could be wrong, that the image on the Chopping Mall poster is pretty good. It's not a great piece of artwork, but the image that, and the idea the image is selling is great. To me, it's the logo. As a guy who came from comics, it sort of almost had a comics logo kind of quality to it in terms of the lettering. the title treatment, and I just that blast of red, that blood red against a black background, with that very attractive kind of horror movie lettering, and it had to have been hand lettered. I can't believe that was actually a type font back in the 80s. I thought that was fantastic, and I just thought it was really a grabber, and I loved it. But again, it wasn't until decades afterwards that I discovered that the movie was held in any regard.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Chopping Mall, and I never knew this about you, that you actually worked in comics, because I've always thought of Chopping Mall kind of as a comic book movie, as a horror comic movie, brought to life a horror comic.
It's an interesting thought. I never really considered that before, but I think it all comes down to this, John. Storytelling is storytelling, and if you're in the storytelling business one way or the other, it all bleeds over. I mean, look at how comics are now the dominant IP for most movies. Unfortunately, I'm a little tired of them, but still, when Frank Miller, who did The Dark Knight, kind of got scooped up by Hollywood when he moved out here, and to varying levels of success. But storytelling is storytelling. Good dialogue is good dialogue. Good characters are good characters. Solid action or imaginative action is still it's all consistent in terms of being storytelling, and that applies to just writing fiction too. Whatever captures the imagination of the audience is a good thing, and somehow I can't explain it, Chopping Mall has captured the imagination of the audience. I will say this: we benefited from having a fantastic score by Chuck Serino, which I think does a lot for the picture.
Oh, it does.
And the robots worked, and they were practical. And the other thing is, the movie has humor. I think that's really key. I mean, I don't pay as much attention to horror films today as perhaps I could or should, but I would think that any horror movie that had any component of humor in it is probably going to find the audience is going to land with the audience maybe in a great way. So, I mean, we had all of the menu items on Chopping Mall to make it a success. I just didn't imagine that it was, based on that preview screening that night and the mediocre reviews that we got from everybody.
Well, like we said earlier with the newer horror stuff, I am totally on board with your opinion on that, and I think a lot of times, to me, is people are trying to take and make a horror movie an art house film, and it doesn't work that way. Horror movies are meant to be shot kind of poorly to an extent, have a grainy feel to them, a dirty, but be fun and take you on a roller coaster ride and play on all the different spectrums of emotion, not just constant from beginning to end of just doom, gloom, and sadness. That's why I don't much like the Conjuring movies that much, because it's like, Jesus, it's just a slog fest to get through this. And it's nothing against the filmmakers, but it's just not fun to me.
Well, the thing is, laughter and fear are very interesting cousins, emotionally speaking. People laughing in a horror movie doesn't mean they're laughing at the movie. They're usually laughing with it. And I think that's a component that I just think it's forgotten. But I also think the 21st century has so far been a century without a lot of humor. I don't know. The thing about the 80s, and I refer to the 80s as the go-go 80s, that it was especially the 80s, it was the throw it up against the wall and see if it sticks decade. And the economics of the movie business, I think, connected with that. There are an awful lot of bad direct-to-video movies, probably more bad direct-to-video movies in all genres than there are good ones. But the economics were, well, let's throw it against the wall and see if it sticks. And strangely enough, they did. I mean, listen, the 80s kind of brought film noir back. Not as artful, certainly not in black and white. But somebody once said, yeah, these erotic thrillers, you got a couple of actors, maybe a couple of guns and some boobs. That was it. No big stunts, no special effects, no pyro. And if you were remotely clever or good at it, those movies played. Once Basic Instinct showed you didn't really need a whole lot to make a decent erotic thriller. You needed a script, of course. We saw 700,000 of them, in the video stores, and some were good.
Well, I think it goes back, and a credit to you all from that decade that made films, from you to Corman to Cohen and Carpenter and all these others. You all were rebels. You just, I
I'm the
mean, to
most
be
middle. I am the most middle class guy you'll ever meet. I'm not a rebel,
I
but
get that, but you all weren't scared to take chances to tell a story.
you know, again, I've said it 3 times already. I'll say it again. We made a movie we wanted to see, and I think if you're a filmmaker, that is so important, because we had a good time making Chopping Mall. We had 20 nights at the mall and 2 nights at the studio, and overall, it was fun to do. We got really lucky in that regard, because sometimes making movies like this can be a slog, as you said before. Um, but you have to have propellant beyond a paycheck. And certainly nobody was making a lot of money on Chopping Mall, that's for sure. I think Roger and Julie did pretty well, but we didn't. But we had the propellant to make this movie. And I think, I really believe this, that whether you have 100,000 or 100 million, you have to really want to see the movie. You can't be jaundiced. There's too much. God, there's so much that goes into a movie, not the least of which is your emotions and your feelings and your aspirations. And, you want it to be worth something. There's an old saying, nobody sets out to make a bad movie. And it's really true. Even incompetent filmmakers don't set out to make a bad movie. They just do. And
Mm-hmm.
so the thing that was great about the 80s is the economics of movie making, and the economics in terms of the revenue stream created this great opportunity for a lot of people to be Larry Cohen and John Carpenter and all of these guys who were saying, yeah, let's do this. And as you know as well as anybody, I'm sure, certain filmmakers, their stock rose with every sort of success. And people who weren't successful or weren't good at it, they never really went beyond a certain level. But I miss those days. I mean, I think everybody misses being young, but I miss those days where it wasn't as complicated to make a movie.
Well, I think that, I don't think, I know it still exists, but now it's in the indie format where, young up and coming filmmakers like my friend Steve Merlo, who was in the chat, um, are taking what you all used to do back then, and now they're doing it today without, they don't have the big budget. They don't have the big studio. All they have is a dream, a script, and Indiegogo, to fund their project. And to be truthfully honest, those movies are better than the shit you see in the theater, because there's heart, passion, there's that want to do it. And you, like you said, it's a movie you as the director or the writer wants to see on the screen. It's not some corporate created mess that it's like, hey, let's just take Michael Myers and throw him into space, or whatever, and just to put asses in seats.
Well, corporate filmmaking to me is the worst of what has become the Hollywood, because, yeah, again, it goes to the economics. Let's never forget, it's a business. And now, again, in the 21st century, marketing and demographics and data become components for whether or not a movie gets made. Vestron needed product when we submitted Chopping Mall. They said, okay, sounds good. And the economics of what they spent We're not a problem for them to take a flyer on this nutty idea. But today, I have a friend who's a writer, producer in television, and he's been developing a series pilot. And nowadays, you try to get a production company on board. So you got to pitch to them. Then you get the production company on board. Then you develop it with them. And then once they feel it's been developed correctly, whatever that means, then you write the script for the pitch that you take out when you go to the networks or the streamers. And so there's all these steps. And then at one point, some of the pitch has to be run by the marketing or data people. And you go, all I know is this: I could never do that. I would rather write a script on my own, go with my instincts, tell the story I think I want to tell, do it the best way I can, invest it with the best characters, because I still think the one constant is the better the characters, the better the movie, and not just for me, but for the audience. And I'll give you a great quick example of that. I really like the first Avengers movie. I call it the Star Wars of comic book movies. And what do you remember out of that nearly 3-hour epic? You remember all the character bits. You don't remember any of the action. The only piece of action I remember is when Hawkeye is on the corner of that office building, just rapid firing his arrows, taking out aliens left and right. And I go, okay, that's why he's one of the Avengers. Because even as a comic book fan, when I was a kid, I always thought Hawkeye was a weak addition to the Avengers. But that's why. But what do you remember? Every bit in that movie is a character bit, and often funny. So I've seen no proof to say that I'm wrong when it comes to the idea of making a movie. You have to have characters that people want to spend time with. By the way, I'll share something with you that cost me hundreds of dollars to learn a long time ago. I've taken many writing classes. And one of the boot camps I went to was taught by a guy named Dan Gordon, who was a very successful TV writer. He worked with Michael Landon on his 2 series and written some features. He wrote Gotcha and Tank and a few others. And I didn't remember very much of what he taught me, but I remembered one thing. And he said the purpose of a screenplay is to make a movie star fall in love. And meaning the actor goes, I want to play that part. Sometimes it's not about the money, it's about the part. And so they may take less money because they want to do that part. And again, goes back to character. What are the things you remember from anything you watch or read? 95% of the time, it's going to be the characters. 5% is just the idea. Like Jaws is one of the all-time great story ideas. The Thing, all the versions of The Thing, is like one of the great story ideas. But most of the time, you don't cruise on story idea. I mean, Chopping Mall sort of had this interesting high concept at its core, but I think we cared about those kids or those young adults. Part of that was casting too, because I think the characters are a bit underwritten, if I'm being honest. But we didn't know any better. But I think the actors gave those characters a bit more juice than was on the page. And I think that's the trick. But nowadays, corporate movie making is like, it's all about risk. It's about this. It's, well, can we sell that? I personally don't care for the way movies are made today because it makes it tougher for me to get my projects off the ground. I'll tell you one other great movie industry story. I met this guy, Robert Relier, who was Steve McQueen's partner in the late 60s at Solar Productions, which was Steve's production company. And Bob is telling me he's having a conversation with Steve McQueen, and McQueen says, I think I want to do the cop picture. And Steve McQueen had a reputation for being very, very flaky. And so Relier said, are you sure? He says, yeah, I think I want to do it. You think? I want to do it. Okay. Bob Relier walks across the Warner Brothers lot out here in Burbank, goes to Jack Warner's office, says to his receptionist assistant, is he in? And she says, yeah, go right on in. So Bob Relier walks into Jack Warner's office and he says, Jack, Steve wants to do the cop picture. Jack Warner says, cops today are not real popular with the kids. So even in the 60s, the youth audience was an important component. And Relier says, I think Steve can make that work. And Jack Warner says, okay. He said, can you have it by Christmas? And Relier said, yeah, I think we can have it by Christmas. And he said, okay, go make it. And that's how Bullet got a green light. Less than 5 minutes. A filmmaker with credibility goes to the head of a studio. The studio understands he's going to have a Steve McQueen movie for Christmas. Big fucking hit, of course, and a classic. And I heard that and I said, yeah, man, I missed that. It was an exclusive club to be in, but boy, just no bullshit. Just filmmakers and moguls who knew how to make movies. They could just make a decision and then things would get started.
And to me, that was the movie that cemented Steve McQueen's legend, was Bullet.
Oh, yeah. I think that, Steve McQueen is known as the king of cool. And I think that's the movie where he really earned that title.
I mean, Ford Motor Company even used to, they don't anymore, but they used to make a Bullet Edition Mustang that you would have to special order, but where the Mustang logo normally goes on the back and front, it just had Bullet written on it. And
right.
then it was number so-and-so or however many they made.
Yeah, I just, I think, I'm not just going to say all new movies are bad. They're not. I think the quality of filmmaking is really pretty amazing in a lot of ways. And I think digital filmmaking has helped. Man, when I was making King Cohen, it made editing King Cohen really easy. Most documentaries used to be shot in 16 millimeter film. Now you shoot them digitally. You save a lot of money on lab costs. And then when you cut, you can really fine cut things as opposed to that sort of very primitive way that 16 millimeter film used to be cut. That's why old documentaries didn't quite have the look and feel of a Hollywood feature film because they were much more crude. But today, it's amazing what you can do. So from a technological standpoint, I think movies are fantastic today. I just wish I enjoyed them more.
So King Cohen, I mean, if to go kind of full circle back to that, because I don't think we really talked on this, but from reading, you didn't know Cohen, Larry, prior to making this film. So what inspired you to make the documentary? Was it just the fact that you were a huge Cohen fan?
Yes is sort of part of the answer to that. But the full answer to your question is I was producing DVD special features and commentaries because I'm also a film historian. I mean, one of the things I do is I do a lot of commentaries for Kino Lorber Studio Classics. It's a great thing to have to do during the pandemic. Let me tell you, it gave me something I could do at home. But home video was starting to fade in terms of its popularity. There used to be a lot of money to do special features. And then that really started to just really dip. And I said, I think I need to do a feature. Because I was pretty good at doing the special feature stuff, and I think I'm very good at doing commentaries, partly just as a historian, but also as a guy who did film journalism when I was very young. So I said, okay, how do I take all those skills and maybe make something out of it? And I realized it was very hard to just want to say to somebody, hey, let me make a feature. Because I used to do special features. One has very little to do with the other. But I'm thinking, I think I'd seen the Roger Corman documentary. And for some reason, I always, I know a lot about Roger. I know that Roger is deified. He's a little bit of a fraud, but he's mostly legit because Roger, the producer, was always interested in what Roger could get from Roger, the director. In terms of saving money and time, et cetera, et cetera. But I thought that the real auteur who did horror and just outrageous movies in general was Larry, because I was a fan of his movies, and I saw all these movies after It's Alive, and it would say written, produced, and directed by Larry Cohen, and you go, he deserves, he deserves the authorship of that movie. So I asked some friends of mine at Image Entertainment who I was working for, um, is there any way we can sort of figure out what this might cost? Because I wanted to go to the guys in the front office and say, hey, I want to do this feature. And I think they could have financed it, but they said, yeah, sounds great. When you're done, maybe we'll acquire it. That's the other dirty word, acquire. People want to spend $10 on something that costs $100. So okay, so it went on the back burner for a while. And then when Kickstart came in, I said, maybe that's a way to go. And I did a Kickstart, and I was a tremendous failure at it. I couldn't have flopped harder if I really pushed myself off a cliff. And so I said, well, all right, that's not going to work. And then I met Matt Verbois, who is one of the partners at La La Land Records, which is a collector soundtrack label. And I was a customer. I'm a huge film music fan. And I met him, strangely enough, at Comic-Con through a friend of mine who knew my comics work, but he worked for Matt as an occasional producer. So the sort of synchronicity of this is great. So I'm introduced to Matt, and I say, oh, I'm a big fan of your work. And he goes, you the Steve Mitchell that wrote Chopping Mall? And I said, yeah. I was a little trepidatious. And he says, I love Chopping Mall. And he was an indicator to me that maybe people out there like the movie. So we started talking, and we got to know each other socially. And then I said, well, this guy's got a record label. He gets things produced. And he had said to me socially that he wanted to maybe do other stuff. So I call him up and say, hey, Matt, I got an idea for a project, a non-record project. And he says, well, I don't know if now is the right time, but let's have lunch. Because we were real kindred spirits and we enjoyed each other's company. And so we go to this place near Warner Brothers, have lunch. And as soon as I'm finished with lunch, I said, I got this idea. I want to do a documentary about Larry Cohen. And literally, I swear to you, before the N in Cohen came out of my mouth, Matt goes, I'm already interested. And then for the rest of the lunch, I sort of explained what I had in mind. And so I was driving, and I drove him back to his office, and he said, before he got out of the car, he says, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. And we started finding money to get started. Well, I left out an important thing. I didn't know Larry, but when I was kickstarting, I said, I guess I ought to call this guy up and see if he wants a movie about him. And so somebody I know got me his phone number, and it took me about an hour to build up the courage to dial his digits. I'm just kind of like, oh man, oh boy, I don't want to come off like an asshole. Oh Jesus, it was I was literally beating myself up from all these different angles, and then I took a very deep breath and I said, okay, let's go, and just fear or not, I was going to make the call. So I made the call, and after 3 rings, I hear hello. And I know it's Larry because I'd heard a couple of his commentary tracks, so I knew his voice. I said, hi, Mr. Cohen, my name is Steve Mitchell. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm interested in doing a documentary about you. I've been working for Image Entertainment, doing DVD special features and producing commentaries, but I'm interested in doing a feature, and I'd love to do a feature about you because I'm an enormous fan. And then he sort of says, and I do a terrible Larry impersonation, but whenever I talk Larry, I have to do the impersonation. It's like, well, it's about time someone wanted to do a documentary about me. So he said, so come on up to the house. So I go to his house in Beverly Hills. And if you know Larry's movies, his house is in virtually every movie he makes to one degree or another. His first movie, Bone, was shot almost entirely at the house. And Larry told me, he says, yeah, I liked having a movie where I didn't have to commute to work. I could just come downstairs and I'd be on set. So anyway, so I found Larry to be very pleasant. He offered me a cup of coffee and a cookie. I had coffee and I said, listen, I want to do it. He says, well, if you can get it financed, I'll help you any way I can. And it took a while. We got it financed. We got enough to get started to shoot. We started shooting, and pretty much right out of the gate, I knew I may have tapped into something. because Larry's got great recall. He's a little overly verbose. I found out when we were cutting that he could start a story, do a little sidebar, then come back and tell the story almost again. When you're listening to it, you're sort of caught up in it. But he was great. And I also realized that after 10 minutes, we had 2 cameras on him in the first day. We did, I think, 3 days. I think I had about 17, 18 hours of raw footage from him. I could have just said to the guys, let's go out and have lunch, because he was off to the races. I had pages and pages of questions. I had done a lot of prep, because you never know. Somebody might say, yes, no, it was fun, it was tough. So you got to be able to keep going. Not with Larry. Once you put him in front of the camera, say, Larry, talk about your life. We literally could have come back 3 hours later after having lunch and he still would have been talking. Fantastic. I mean, when you have a subject like that, that's like, that's a gift from heaven. So Larry was easy to work with, always very available to us. And he became fun to get to know. And one of the things that was great about making the movie was that we became friends. And because we're both New Yorkers, because he was born and raised in New York, we had a naturally sort of combative attitude when it came to movies. And Larry's wife, Cynthia, who's a doll, I adore Cynthia, she loved sort of making coffee for us and then having us just standing on the sidelines and watching us, waiting for us to, mostly Larry kicking my brains in for disagreeing with him. He once said to me, he says, if I want you to have an opinion, I will tell you you can have one. One of my favorites was, there's a movie which you may or may not know called The 7 Ups, which was kind of a unofficial sequel to The French Connection with Roy Scheider in it. And it's got a fantastic car chase, and it's still one of the best car chases ever put on film. And Larry said, they screwed up. They should have put the car chase at the end of the movie. I said, no, Larry, it needed to be where it was, because it sets up the juice for the rest of the movie, for the third act. He goes, no, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. I said, Larry, I don't think you know what you're talking about this. And so he would just be kicking my brains in, and it was really kind of fun. And his wife would she'd be by the sidelines laughing her head off. And that was Larry, because the thing about, I once asked Cynthia, I said, Larry's a narcissist, right? And she says, oh God, yes. And we had a screening in London. I think it was after we had the festival screening, we had a screening in London. And then I was a guest along with Joe Kramer, who's composed the score for King Cohen, on this. There's a British critic named Mark Kermode. And Mark Kermode has a monthly thing called Kermode Live 3D. And he invites 4 or 5 filmmakers to the stage of the British Film Institute. But he never tells anybody, because there could be cancellations. So we were in London, and he said, do you want to do it? And I said, sure. My greatest fear was tripping on the way up to the stage, which thank God I didn't do. But at one point, they had a big image of Larry on the screen behind me. And I said, and I looked up at it for a second. I said, all I can think of is Larry telling me, stop talking about you and start talking more about me. And everybody thought that was pretty funny, but that was Larry kind of in a nutshell. And when we had screenings of the movie at festivals, one of the things that was so gratifying was, I think Larry was getting a curtain call for his career from the audience, because the audience was always enormously enthusiastic in their applause and cheers for Larry, specifically in the moment, but I think career-wise. And I think it meant a lot to him. Because when I hooked up with Larry, Larry was pretty jaundiced. Even though we wrote every day, the phone wasn't ringing. And I think that hurt him emotionally, because he knew he still had lots of good ideas, which he did and does. Did. He's gone now. But I've read a number of scripts that haven't been produced. There's some good ones.
Yeah, I know he in one interview was talking about how he would sell scripts to different studios, and then all of a sudden their hierarchy would change. And then the new guy coming in would be like, "Oh, I don't want to touch that Larry Cohen movie." So it's like now my script's sitting down in some vault somewhere in at a studio. Just different things like that.
Yeah, there's some of that, but I know Larry's complaining, but he got well paid for those scripts. He made a lot of money. I mean, Larry, it's interesting how Larry made his Larco movies his way on his terms, but then he was a very successful screenwriter for hire. And he just, I always say that there's kind of a triangle. It's called luck, timing, and talent. And if you're going to be successful, you need two of the three. Doesn't matter which combination, but you needed two of the three. The thing about Larry is he had all three. He had luck. His timing was perfect, getting into television in the 60s and then deciding to make his Larry Cohen movies in the 70s. And then the talent, of course, was always there. I mean, I've read enough of Larry's scripts to know that all of his scripts needed at least a second or third draft just to polish it. But the idea was good, the structure was good, it was solid. It just needed to be refined a bit. And I think that's what I said when Larry was directing his scripts, he could do that. But when he was selling his scripts, he sort of had to, I think, maybe put more on the page than he would for one of his own movies. But he didn't mind because he was making a lot of money. Larry was very lucky as that he decided to be Larry Cohen at exactly the right time and had the talent to back it up.
Have any of you all that's his, real close friends, have any of you all talked to his widow at all about maybe taking some of those scripts and actually making movies with
The
them?
answer is yes. She things are available to us. I can't say anything more than that. But
okay.
He almost had a project with J.J. Abrams for an anthology show, which was going to take a bunch of those scripts and make like hour-longs out of them. And that project didn't come together. And then this was not that long before he passed on. But those scripts are still available. There's some talk. We're talking to her about maybe trying to take one of his movies and expand it into a series. Can't say which. Mostly because I'm superstitious, but B, there might be a rights issue, so I'm not going to say.
It's okay. I was just wondering if maybe
there was. No, but it's a good thing to wonder about. I mean, he said, to read his "It's Alive 4" script, and I thought it was a very good idea. I think it just needed a dialogue pass. The one problem that Larry sometimes had as a writer is he wrote what he wanted the characters to say as opposed to having the characters say what the characters should say. He wouldn't always quite find the voice of the characters. He knew the content, but he didn't write it that way all the time. Because I think he would leave it there for the actors to interpret it, especially when he was making his own scripts into films. So, but the thing is, the ideas were always there. The setups were always there. I mean, he was a creative machine. Let me tell you something. This guy has written a bunch of screenplays. Coming up with an idea that's worth writing is hard. You can always come up with ideas, but is it worth writing? Is it worth investing your time in? And that's one of the things that's tough about writing is, again, having an idea, especially today. In the old days, you could write something. If you thought it was a good story, there's a chance it could get made at some level. But today, you can't really write features unless you're writing art house features or grindhouse or lower budget features. Because the studios don't want them, because the studios have this kind of machine in place that is going to make the corporate version of stories. And But Larry was just writing anything that came to mind that he thought would be interesting. And strangely enough, he had great luck at selling a lot of those scripts. I mean, scripts like, Phone Booth was very successful. What was the other? Jason Statham was in it. Chris Evans was in it. Kim Basinger was in it.
I know what you're talking about. I just can't get it.
Yeah, I'm having a senior moment here, but that was a great idea for a script. Now, Larry didn't direct it, and they had another guy come in and do a dialogue pass on it, and made it really, really work. That was great. What's the James Woods, Brian Dennehy bestseller? Was another one of his scripts. He did that Don Johnson thriller that Sidney Lumet directed. Boy, I'm having a tough time with names today. But anyway, Larry was a very crafted screenwriter, but he was still working at a time where the economics for a Larry Cohen could work. Also the other thing, and I don't know if you talk about this with anybody, but I really miss the middle. And what I mean by the middle is middle budget stories, movies from like Orion and TriStar and Atlantic, and those studios that made these middle-sized movies, which weren't about saving the world or preventing the world from an apocalypse of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
I love those kinds of movies. Most of my specs are those kinds of movies, but I don't know if there's a market for them anymore. It's very hard being a writer these days. I mean, somebody said, what do I have to do to be a screenwriter? I would say, don't be a screenwriter. Get another career. And then if you want to write as a hobby, sure, maybe you'll get lucky. But it's very hard to make a living as a writer anymore, unless you write television.
Yeah.
Network television. You want to make a living, you got to write network television. Streaming, I don't know how anybody makes a living doing those things. I really don't. But this is all optimistic. Huh?
I was going to say, to be truthfully honest, a young Larry Cohen today would make a killing in television with all the ideas he had back in the day.
I think he would do very well in the streaming world. But again, that's one of his that was his major superpower. As John Landis said, he's an idea machine. Or was it Joe Dante said he's an idea machine? But one of them said that. And I think Landis said that, Larry had a very fertile imagination. And Landis then said, I wish I was that fertile. And it's really true. Larry was a uniquely creative character. And I think there's a reason for that.
He was a prodigy. To me, I mean, to be truthfully honest, when it comes to screenwriting. I mean,
I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. But the other thing is this. Larry wasn't interested in anything other than movies. I think before he met Cynthia, he had been married, but he also dated a lot. He had, went out with a lot of his actresses, I think, something, between marriages. He liked having fun. He liked to travel, but he was not into sports. He had no hobbies, as far as I know. I mean, he was a pure writing machine. And that's, again, goes to how unique he was.
Will never be another one.
No, there won't. I mean, Tarantino is... Oh, here's the other thing I figured out. Like, Larry was very unique in that he was a triple hyphenate. You had Sam Fuller in the 50s and into the 60s. He was a triple hyphenate who was kind of mainstream. I mean, I think there might have been triple hyphenates in the ultra grind world of maybe 50s or 60s cinema. And then you had Larry in the 70s and the 80s, and then Tarantino came on, to pick up that mantra. Not a lot of guys like those guys. All with, by the way, very unique voices as well.
Yeah, to me, Larry Cohen, he was kind of like, I don't know, Howard Hawks and William Castle kind of molded into one. To be truthfully honest, it was because he had that salesmanship of a William Castle, but he had the imagination of a Howard Hawks.
Larry, no, it's a great it's a great sort of mashing together. But the thing also about Larry is Larry was an enormous movie fan. I think Larry, if I was to, I never asked him this. I wish I had. I said, Larry, if you could have been born earlier, would you have been happy with that? And he probably would have said, yeah, I would have gone to Warner Brothers and written all those because he loved Warner Brothers movies, hated MGM movies because he thought they were boring. So he and I shared that. But I think Larry, in many ways, wanted to be Michael Curtiz. He wanted to work with movie stars. He loved old Hollywood. He loved movie stars. That's why a lot of old timers were in his movies, because it was a chance for him to meet the stars that mattered to him when he was a kid. And I think every generation has that.
I could have so seen Larry back in the 30s making some of them old Universal monster movies. I could have so seen him, especially Frankenstein. He would have been perfect for Frankenstein.
Yeah. Frankenstein would have been a lot less theatrical looking had Larry directed.
He would have made the girl get thrown into the pond probably comical somehow, I'm sure.
That's an interesting thing to think about. What would Larry have done at Universal back in the day? Who knows? He might have done Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein back in the day.
Oh God, Abbott and Costello, I think would have loved him.
Oh, sure.
Especially Lou Costello.
Well, again, I think Larry, all the actors I ever interviewed, anybody I interviewed loved Larry, because he was so outgoing. He was, for a guy who was, he was an interesting contradiction. And he was a narcissist. I think he was an introvert and an extrovert when he needed to be. You put Larry on a stage or in front of a bunch of people, he's totally extroverted, but on his own, he's very contained. He creates his own bubble living.
I could say this, and if listeners haven't never really watched a Larry Cohen interview, I can say this. The man is not scared to tell you who his favorite filmmaker is and the greatest filmmaker is. And it was Larry Cohen.
Yep. Larry had no shortage of ego. Like I said, he was a narcissist, but here's the difference. He was an entertaining narcissist.
Yeah.
As opposed to a bore. He was a remarkable guy, and I'm so happy that the project happened. Because it gave me a calling card, and the response has been excellent to the movie, which is very gratifying. Matt Verboys and I are the best of friends, and we're working on another project right now. We're doing a documentary about Wings Hauser, the king of the video stores. But also it gave me a chance to get to know Larry. That project for me worked on so many different levels, in terms of the professional level, just the friendship level, the personal level, the meeting your your idols kind of level. I miss Larry a lot. I stay in touch with his wife, and every once in a while we all get together and, we all have a Larry moment. And I said, yeah, I miss those cappuccinos in the kitchen where he'd, kick my brains in about something that he didn't agree with me on.
You made something that it introduced new fans to him, but you also made something that honored his legacy while he was still here with us, and he was able to appreciate it. And I think, as you know, when he passed not even 2 years after you made that film, I think in a way I think maybe he felt like his life was, complete. He finally felt appreciated throughout all us fans, and got to experience that.
It was very gratifying for everything that you just mentioned. The other thing that was interesting as a sidebar was I always knew that the Larry Cohen fans would like this. That was a no-brainer for me. I said, I know Larry Cohen. Anybody who likes Larry Cohen movies will find this interesting. because you get to know Larry and you get to know how he thinks. The thing that was the biggest surprise for me was the wives and girlfriends. When we would have a screening and the wives and girlfriends would come up to me, I never heard of this guy. He's really interesting. I want to see some of his movies. And I say, well, there you go. I guess I did my job. Now, I don't think the wives or the girlfriends, unless they're genre fans, are really going to relate. I know my wife never said, she thought Larry was fascinating and interesting. And she goes, yeah, I wouldn't like any of those movies. But my wife never liked genre movies. So
Yeah.
But it was an interesting thing to find out that he's so appealing and so interesting that you don't have to be a fan to enjoy the movie. And I think it comes back to the, take everything sort of full circle. What is Larry Cohen? He's a great character. And that's what people remember when they go to the movies, great characters.
To me, I mean, the name of your film says it all. He was the king of the B movie. He was.
Now, and by the way, we always refer to him as the king. Have you talked to the king? I heard from the king. The king wants this. Oh, yeah, the king was. And then we told that to his wife, Cynthia, and she goes, perfect.
Don't swell his ego perfect. Anymore.
Yeah. It's a little bit of an obsession of mine right now, which is people who are part of the greatest generation. And Larry was kind of the latter part of it, but he was a greatest generation types. And I think that, America is not quite the same place because a lot of the greatest generation folks have passed on. And, the other thing is that people like Larry, they weren't just about, Larry was the guy who's probably the least technologically knowledgeable as a filmmaker. He had guys that he relied on to shoot and to cut. But Larry was all about art. Believe it or not, his movies were influenced by art. They were influenced by films. They were not influenced by technology. I think, strangely enough, some of his best directed from a technological standpoint movies were like The Ambulance, and then he did an episode of that anthology series that was on Showtime. I wish I had the IMDb up in front of me, but Larry could work with modern tools. Larry knew how to do that, but he wasn't about the tools. He wasn't about the technology. He was about, making movies with old timers. And, he would never admit this to you or to me, but I think he was a huge fanboy at heart because you can feel it in the movies,
Was that series called Masters of Horror?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it was. And Larry, of course, said his was the best.
Well, of course.
Well, it's pretty good, I have to say. It's as the Masters of Horror episodes went, it was probably one of my favorites. And Larry is up here somewhere. What do you mean, one of your favorites? Or what's your favorite? He had an ego on him, but I think it was earned.
It was called Pick Me Up by Larry Cohen.
That's right, based on the David Scow story. And it's a great idea. It's no wonder that Larry took to it, because it was a very Larry Cohen kind of idea. Competing serial killers. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and I've never heard of that in like real life, where two serial killers. I've heard of copycats that tried to outdo the original, but never two that's like, I'll outdo you tonight.
James Ellroy, who for a long time was one of my favorite writers, and then his stuff kind of lost its appeal for me. But an early, a pre sort of LA Confidential novel he wrote had to deal with it was a first person serial killer story. And at one point he hooks up with another serial killer, and kind of the thrust of it was during that part of the book, they were kind of exchanging notes. They were talking shop, serial killer tradecraft. And I'm going, man, you got to be a little twisted to come up with an idea like this. But Elroy has sort of proven that he's a little out there where the buses don't roam. Although he's a wonderful writer. But it was a crazy ass idea. I got to say, I'm surprised that Larry never actually came up with an idea like that, even though he did direct that Masters of Horror. But
I think that's on Shudder right now, where you can watch it for free. Well, as long as you're a Shudder subscriber.
subscriber, yeah. King Cohen was on Shudder for a long time, and I think we're trying to get it back on Shudder because I think that it does belong. I think fans should be able to access Shudder and then access King Cohen. It just seems like a marriage, a perfect marriage.
Well, Joe Bob Briggs has been real big on showing Cohen movies on his last drive-in. I mean, he's had Q and different ones like that. I think he even had The Stuff on there too, which he also said too wasn't one of his favorite Cohen movies. I don't know. It was always just a guilty pleasure to me because it was just such an homage to so many different movies that had came before it. But yeah, it could have definitely used some more polish here and there.
Needed another draft. I'll just put it that. But it's a nutty idea. It's a nutty, crazy, audacious idea, which, for the most part, he sort of pulls off without a lot of, and he didn't have a lot of financial resources, and that being the case, I think he did a pretty good job.
I know there's some toy companies out there that actually make the stuff containers and sell in Hot Topics and places like that. I've seen.
Yeah, well, I got one of the real stuff cups, so I thumb my nose at them. Larry would go to some of these shows, and he produced all these stuff cups, and he had them in his house, and so we would bring stuff cups to the shows and sell the stuff cups.
Just sign them and sell them.
Sign them and sell them. That's what he did.
You could make a quick $100 like that.
He made a couple more bucks than that.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, me, I probably wouldn't be able to charge about $10, if that. No, I'd probably have to give them away for free, to be truthfully honest.
No, he it just made me feel so good to be around him while he was, back kind of in the spotlight, because he was enjoying it. He was enjoying it. When we went to Horror Hound, I wound up going there, and I just basically followed him around for a weekend with a camera, and he was enjoying it. He enjoyed being Larry Cohen.
Yeah, he was Larry Cohen's biggest fan, but guess what? We all loved him too.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. So anyway, that's my story about Larry. He was the greatest. Sometimes it's tough meeting your heroes because they can disappoint you. Strangely enough, when I worked in comics, I met a number of my heroes, and they disappointed me.
Yeah, I've heard of that. Luckily, I got to meet, my hero was always Kevin Eastman, and everybody that knows me knows I put Kevin Eastman up on a pedestal, the guy that created Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm.
But I always heard that, never meet your heroes, but I got to meet him, and he didn't disappoint me, thank God. He was still that down-to-earth kid from New England that didn't forget where he came from, and that was what I appreciated.
Yeah, and you got to give him and
Peter Laird
a lot of credit for believing in themselves and believing in their product. And I think that's sort of part and parcel about what we're talking about is, if you believe in something and you think it's a good idea, do whatever you can not to give up on it. I mentioned I did some more work in the animation business. I was working on the Spawn animated series.
Oh, the old HBO series?
Yeah. I was in the storyboard department on that. And it was a great job because it was a great crew. And I never really knew, I'm blanking on it right now, the guy who created Spawn, the artist.
Todd McFarlane?
Thank you so much. God, what an idiot I am. But Todd would come in once in a while, and he was an interesting guy. I don't think he was a rocket scientist, but he had a lot of belief in himself, and I think creating image comics and stuff like that with the other guys was kind of a brilliant move. But what the story behind McFarlane Toys, and this goes towards, if you believe in something, don't let it go. And he was lucky enough that he loved toys, but he never thought toys were terribly well manufactured or designed or executed. So he decided he wanted to do toys for his characters, his Spawn characters, and he created McFarlane Toys, which is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the great toy companies. I mean, if you like, monster figures or action figures and stuff, he was doing sports figures, he was doing war stuff, he was doing, I don't know if they're still in business because I don't buy that stuff anymore. But at the time, it was a truly remarkable thing that he did. And that was because he didn't see the downside. He only saw the upside. He probably could have had 20 really, really smart guys say, you're making a big mistake. You are treading on the shores of people who know how to do this. Anyway, he just never said, I'm not going to do it. He just made it happen. And then he created, in essence, I think something greater than Spawn itself by creating these great toys. I have a couple of them still on my shelves.
I have a whole wall of horror movie collectible figures still in the box. Some of them are McFarlane. And
Yeah.
you're right. Todd opened up another revenue stream for horror movies, because nobody wanted to make an action figure out of horror movies back in the day. And then he comes along and revolutionizes it a little bit. And now all of a sudden these filmmakers like a Toby Hooper, John Carpenter, everyone's going, oh, well, I could make a adult collectible action figure of Michael Myers or Jason, and I can make 40 to 50 bucks a pop off that. Let's go,
Yeah, Todd really opened the door on that, and the quality, a friend of mine gave me for Christmas a Jack Bauer 24 action figure.
Yes, that's
and it's Jack kicking the door in and, pointing a gun. And it cracked me up because you could see on the floor, the base of that toy, the spent, cartridges, that the attention to detail and the sculpting was so great. And that's just because, Todd wanted to make toys he wanted to own. Just like when we did Chopping Mall, we made a movie we wanted to see. It doesn't really matter what the discipline is. Creativity it's one big thing. It's just that we have various parts of it when we make films or
I'm still waiting on a Killbot action figure.
Come on. I've seen a couple. Jim has got a little sculpt of one that was done at very limited. Another guy, I think, made a 3D sculpture. But I'm sitting back here and I'm going, am I missing something? Is there something out there that I haven't seen? Because, the robot would make a perfect action figure.
Yeah, with the little light up eye and everything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I have no idea why no one has ever done this before. Maybe they just didn't know where to go for the rights or something like that. I don't know.
Hey, not Mego. Yeah, Mego. Todd McFarlane, Super 7, all you toy companies. Where's our Killbots?
Yeah. I heartily second that. But sooner or later, I have a saying. This is when I was a soundtrack collector, and things were starting to come out on DVD, on CD rather. And I would say, if you live long enough and you're patient, almost everything shows up. So, and that's been mostly true. So hopefully that'll be the case with the Killbots.
Or it goes away and then comes back, like with vinyl. I used to collect vinyl, and now all of a sudden vinyl's making a comeback, and it's like,
yeah,
shit, And
now
vinyl
is an expensive proposition even today, though. it's tough to pay. Listen, I think somewhere I have a Chopping Mall album in vinyl, and that sucker cost a lot of money. But if you like vinyl, you can hear that score on record. I think it's really collectible now and way out of print.
Yeah,
But
I bought a Pink Floyd The Wall on vinyl the other day, and I got up to the cash register to pay for it, and the lady's like, "Oh, that's $60." I was like, $60 for Pink Floyd's The Wall? I was like, this album is like 50 years old. But then when I opened it up, there was all these little collectible things. There was guitar picks and pictures of the band, and they I can't say Pink Floyd put all the little, bells and whistles into it. So I was like, okay, it does kind of warrant a $60 purchase with the things that they've put inside.
right,
Like
yeah.
the
Well, vinyl these days is not just a way to listen to music; it's also a form of collectible. And I think one of the reasons why it's a collectible, a little backstage information is there are not a lot of places that are around to press it. Getting vinyl pressed is a big and complicated deal right now. La La Land Records put out a few things on vinyl, and they were saying, yeah, it's very hard just to literally get stuff scheduled because
Yeah,
vinyl has made such a comeback.
I know the band Kiss ran into a problem with some pressing. They did they re-released Love Gun, and I bought 2 copies of it because it was a special edition. It had like a splatter artwork on the vinyl, which I thought was cool, and I got it, and it skipped real bad on the side one.
No,
Took it back to Walmart, got another copy, brought it, did the same thing, in the same exact song, same exact place, everything. So I
right,
started researching online and come to find out that they had a bad batch that slipped through quality control and got distributed to Walmarts, and somehow I ended up with 2 of them.
right. Well, circling back to Chopping Mall, is there anything I haven't answered for you
No,
that
sir.
you're curious about?
No, it has been a complete, just truly honor and a pleasure to meet you and to talk with you. And
Thanks.
well, I mean, your movie. I grew up, I wasn't supposed to watch horror, but I did. I had friends that their parents owned video stores, and they used to kind of like meeting my drug dealer in the back alley. They used to sneak me horror movies here and there, and I'd sneak them in the house and watch them, especially when my mom went to bed. And yours was one of them. And
Oh,
I
well, thanks.
always loved Chopping Mall, and I was always big. If the artwork on the VHS tape caught my eye, I rented it, took it home, watched it. Not that it was always a great movie; it wasn't. Especially the John Carpenter Swamp Thing. I saw that cover, and I was like, "Yeah!" Not was it John Carpenter that did the
Wes
Swamp?
Craven.
Yeah, Wes Craven that did Swamp Thing, and I was like, "Yeah, this is going to be awesome." And I got it home, and I was like, "This sucks." But now that I go back and watch it today, I appreciate it for its cheesiness now. But
What's something that's interesting that has struck me over the years is sometimes movies age well out of their original time period. Because you may not in the moment you may not like them when you see them, and if you go back and revisit them, the years sometimes are kind in that this is what it was at the time, and you have some distance from what you may not have liked about the movie at the time, and then you just sort of accept it for the movie that it is. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And maybe that's why Chopping Mall continues to be popular. I don't really know. I no one has given me like maybe the definitive answer. I've got lots of pieces that give me an idea,
well,
but
I can tell you for a fact, anybody and everybody I've ever introduced to that movie never walked away from it going it was bad.
wow,
That is the God's honest truth.
wow,
I've introduced friends to some movies that they were like, "Why do you like that?" Basket Case.
hmm
I love Basket Case. Maybe okay, it's not for everybody, but
right,
yours never had that negative reaction.
wow, wow. My head is swelling. But again, once again, to go back to that thing I said earlier, it's like the audience tells you whether it's any good. You never know. You
So do we,
might think you're in good shape, but it's the audience that usually tells you.
so can we get a Chopping Mall sequel? Wink, wink.
It's strange because some people have talked about that or a remake. I know that there had been talk about a remake. Here's the thing about it. I know everybody would love a sequel. I do know that. The thing about Chopping Mall is we caught lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
We caught lightning in a bottle with the practical robots. We caught lightning in a bottle with the Sherman Oaks Galleria. We caught lightning in a bottle with that cast. And I think as much as people, it's like when you have a great pizza someplace, you go, I want more. And I think Chopping Mall functions on that level in some way. But I think anything that we could do would be sort of an intellectualized continuation of something that two young guys who didn't know any better just said, hey, why don't we do this? And hey, we could do that gag with the elevator at the mall, and then let's throw the stuntman off the third floor, and then let's blow shit up in the middle of the mall with those propane things. It was all in the moment, and it was all just pure creative nuttiness. Now today you said, well, we're going to have to do this, we're going to have to do that, and to make that, it starts to become intellectualized as opposed to just emotional. And I just don't know that we can, I don't know that lightning would strike twice. Certainly, if somebody out there wants to finance one, I'm sure Jim and I can sit down and figure out a way to have a good time with a sequel. But at this point, there's no talk of a sequel, only a remake. And the remake, by the way, would have been a gore fest. That was my understanding, is that they were going to do more horror. I'll leave you with this because I have to go. It's amazing that Chopping Mall is considered a horror movie when at its core, it's really an action movie with horror moments in it. And I'm very proud that we have the second best head explosion of all time. David Cronenberg has got the first. I'm very, I know that it's got horror elements in it, but it's really more of an action movie if you look at it objectively. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Chopping Mall is really sort of, to me, a multi sort of genre picture, but it was sold as a horror picture. And
I think it was like RoboCop before RoboCop.
Yeah. See, they made Chopping Mall with money with RoboCop, which is a movie. It's actually one of my favorite movies of all time. I love because it just gives you everything, and then of course it's directed by the extraordinarily nutty Paul Verhoeven, who, he really hit it out of the park with that one. But yeah, is RoboCop a science fiction movie? Yes. Is it a horror movie? Yes. Is it an action movie? Yes. Well, the same can sort of be said for Chopping Mall, but on a much more intimate level. So anyway, it's, if I seem wistful at this moment, it's kind of, I just, every once in a while I go through, I really miss the 80s because there were so many opportunities to play with these toys and these tools and maybe, get things done that I just miss today.
I always tell people that growing up in the 80s was probably the greatest thing ever because we were in that middle period of the technology boom, but still living life kind of laid back lifestyle of days gone by.
It
So
was still
you
the
had,
analog. It was still the analog era. I think when we became the digital age, everything happened so much faster all the time. And I would love to be 30 years younger. I would love it.
and it meant more to go to a movie theater back in the 80s to actually sit down with your popcorn and drink and watch a movie.
Yeah, where I was going with the young thing is, but if I was younger, I would not have had all the influences I have. When I was growing up in New York City, you could not go anywhere without seeing illustration art someplace, either a movie poster, a book cover, a magazine cover, institutional advertising. You'd have banks and you would see, Jack Davis cartoons, in the windows of banks as a form of advertising. And the thing is, I think I miss art. Now, art exists, but it doesn't exist in the same way. And I think movies, especially, and comics, especially, were influenced by other forms of art, physical art. I mean, cinematographers used to look at paintings by the masters to learn how to light. William Clothier, one of the great outdoor cinematographers, he said he learned how to compose by looking at newspaper strips. Neil Adams brought an illustration vibe to comics because of newspaper strips and illustration. I mean, art was built on art, and now people are building art on technology. And I just think it has a tendency not to be quite as heartfelt.
Yeah.
And look, I can't complain about technology. Like I said, cutting King Cohen was a breeze because I had that technology at my fingertips. It just made it really easy. Said, let's try that. Let's try that. Let's go back. Let's go forward. Let's go. Well, when you're actually cutting film together, that's tough. Which also, and I will one last shout out, and then I do have to go. Leslie Rosenthal, who cut Chopping Mall, did a brilliant job, and she did it on a shitty moviola in a corner of Rogers' old studio. Used to be down in Venice, which used to be a lumber yard that was converted into this very makeshifty kind of studio. And Leslie had this crappy little editing room by herself with lots of film, and she cut Chopping Mall like within an inch of its life. I still think when you look at that movie and you think of that it was cut on almost like a primitive device, how well cut it is. And especially the sequence where the robots break into the furniture store and chase the kids to the back. That is a great piece of editing. And Leslie was a very strong component to the success of the movie.
Yeah, your all's pacing is perfect. I mean,
yeah. And two other things that are worth mentioning. One, people talk about a script has to be a certain length, which I think is the biggest load of crap ever, because our script for Chopping Mall was 110 pages. And the movie, and we used almost everything we shot. I think there were one or two scenes that were left out, but minor, there were pieces. So we just wrote all that action on the page, and the action might have took up quarter of a page or a third of a page, and then of course it goes by in a second on screen. So it's fascinating to me to see like people adhere to script has to be 100 pages now. It used to be 120. It means nothing. The second thing is that what Leslie did with primitive tools goes to just show her talent as a filmmaker. I mean, listen, the tools today are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But she didn't have that. She just had her talent and her taste. And by the way, she cut the movie together really fast. The first cut of Chopping Mall, I think, was mostly the movie we saw. I think there were some trims. There might have been a couple of things that we adjusted, but for the most part, the script we wrote was the script we shot, and more or less the script she cut. So it's nice when it works out that way.
Well, I still love it today, and I still carry the banner for it going, everybody watch it. Go watch it.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It's one of the most underrated films of the 80s, in my opinion, as terms of a horror, action, any of that. I mean, I'm not just telling you that because I'm sitting here talking to you. I really mean that. Like
Thanks.
When I came across you on Facebook, I was like, I've got to talk to Steve Mitchell because I love Chopping Mall.
Well, yeah. So you got King Cohen, you got some of my comics career, you got the whole thing.
Well, Steve, it has been a complete honor and a pleasure to meet you. I am so
Me
glad
too,
to
John.
learn more about Mr. Cohen. You know, God rest his soul. Long live the king, we should say.
He's he's still with me, and he's still with us. He's and he's making people laugh wherever he's wound up right now, which is what he likes to do too. You know, I never could make Larry laugh. By the way, I never got him to crack up. You know,
And
I
maybe he
said that
left inside.
I said that to Cynthia once, and I said I could never make him laugh. And he goes, "Yeah, he's tough. He wants to make you laugh. He doesn't want to laugh at your jokes. He wants you to laugh at his jokes." Anyway, John, listen, this has been a pleasure. Thanks. I'm all talked out.
All right, my friend. It has been an honor. I really mean that. And anytime you ever want to come back on, or just or
Yeah,
I would.
shoot up a flare from time to time and see where I'm at. When
All
my
right.
next project is done, maybe we can talk about that.
Well, I would love to have you on again to talk about more Larry. Yeah, we want to talk about you more, Larry. But you know, or
See, now
whatever.
he's in your head.
Yeah.
Anyway, John, thanks so much. It's been fun, and hopefully we'll do it again.
All right. Well, this is Steve Mitchell, ladies and gentlemen. Go watch his movies, King Cohen and Chopping Mall. You won't be disappointed. Thank you
Thanks so
again,
much.
Steve.
You're welcome.
Bye bye. Well, hold on. There's Mandy. Let me say hello to Miss Cantone. Well, guys, hope you enjoyed that. That was Mr. Steve Mitchell. To me, made one of the best horror comedy, action comedy, whatever genre you want to put it in. One of the best movies, in my opinion, of the 80s. And it wasn't like it was the greatest thing that you ever got to see, but it dealt with a lot of things that we grew up with in the 80s, shopping malls and different things like that. And then you had the robots, which was big, also Transformers, different things like that Steve was talking about. So to me, it was like the perfect 80s movie. But with that said, I've got to get out of here too. I got some things to do today. But thank you guys for joining us, and thanks for all the love and support. And we will see you again next time. Hold on, let me get over here where I can end the broadcast. But we'll see you again next time on Behind the Feeds. Ooh.